Hello and welcome everyone. So this is going to be a solution video for exam 1 in Principles of Microeconomics. So this exam covered the core principles, demand, supply, equilibrium, elasticity, and price controls and taxes, right? So what I'll do is first let me show the exam. So you could stop the video, maybe like go over it yourself, and then come back and I'll go through the walkthrough, the solution. So let me just kind of go through and hover a little bit on each one. As I'm doing this, I hope my microphone ends up holding out. I am making a simultaneous recording of just the audio using my phone because I've been having so many problems with my microphone. So if it ends up that the audio doesn't match my mouth, sorry. I probably had to try to resync the audio because that would have meant maybe my microphone ended up not working. So anyway, so there's 40 questions on this exam. And I don't know exactly how long it's going to be helpful for me to hover over each of the. I realized I kind of had this optimized for printing and not optimized for demonstrating each of the questions for the exam. So I realized this is probably super annoying. It's annoying to me, actually. So hopefully you have a greater tolerance for this than I do. But anyway, it'll pay off in the end because you're able to go through the video and you'll know what questions are upcoming. Okay, so that is the exam. And so now what I'm going to do, I'm making myself car sick. I probably didn't even need to do that. I could just click over to this. All right, now I'm going to go over the solutions. All right, so the first one, opportunity cost arises from the fundamental economic problem of which of the following? Well, it's scarcity. What's going on is, we can eliminate the first three just because they don't fit. But the reason why opportunity cost arises from scarcity is because we have scarce limited resources but unlimited wants. We've got too many things to do with the things we've got. And when we use our resources towards one thing, we lose the ability to use them towards another. That's exactly opportunity cost. Remember, we say opportunity costs are what you get to lose, what you sacrifice, not what you get to do. The cost-benefit principle states a decision should be pursued only if the benefits are greater than the costs. That's just true by definition. That's just what the cost-benefit principle is. Economists convert costs and benefits into money equivalents by evaluating an individual's willingness to pay. Also, kind of true by definition. That's exactly what happens, right? The idea is we can say, how much would you be willing to pay for this thing? What's your valuation for? Coffee, for instance, right? That'd be your money equivalent for the benefit for that item. Or in terms of cost, we could say, what would you pay to avoid having to do this? Like for me, I gave the example of what I'd pay to avoid, what I'd do to avoid having to climb up on a ladder or something. Anyway, so this is a way to ascertain the willingness to pay. In a voluntary economic transaction between a buyer and a seller, actually both the buyer and seller can earn economic surplus from the transaction. We're assuming voluntary economic transaction, both are agreeing to this transaction, and there's gains that can be realized by both. So the example might be, maybe I'd be willing to pay $10 for a latte. The price is $3, so I get $7 worth of surplus, but the seller also comes out with some value too, right? Obviously they're gonna make some profit, and maybe the price was $3, but it cost them $1, right? And so we both walk away from the transaction with some degree of benefit. We call this economic surplus. Buyer's economic surplus or seller's surplus, and then for exam 2, we call that consumer surplus and producer surplus. Sunk costs are those that are incurred regardless of which decision is made. That's almost true by definition, but it's exactly why we ignore sunk costs for the purposes of rational decision making, right? Because you can't change them regardless of which choice you make, and so therefore they're sunk. They're irrelevant for the decision. The opportunity cost of a good, well, the best answer here is it's the value of the next best alternative given up to acquire the good. It's what you've sacrificed. It's what you've given up. It's what you've lost, right? Law of demand refers to the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. That's just true by definition. That is literally the law of demand. I'm going to go through some of these a little bit slower. The first couple were, meant as kind of true by definition, right? So that's all these are. When the marginal benefit of an activity is equal to the price of the activity, what should the rational buyer do? Well, they should do the exact amount. If the marginal benefit was greater than the price, right, the price would be the marginal cost to the consumer following the rational rule, though this is actually rational rule for buyers, right? If the marginal benefit's greater than the price, greater than your marginal cost, you should do more. If it's less, you should do less. But if it's equal, you're optimizing. So you should do that exact amount. What's the quantity supplied? Quantity supplied is the amount that a seller is willing and able to sell at a particular price. And if we have all the possible prices and all the possible quantity supplied pairs, then we have the supply curve. But quantity supplied is just the amount. The equilibrium price is where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded, right? True by definition. It's where the supply curve meets the demand curve. But what happens there, the way we'll describe it is, it's specifically the quantity, the equilibrium quantity is where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded, and that occurs at the equilibrium price. Okay, so 11. If the price of M&M peanut candies increases and the demand for cherry-flavored soft drinks decreases, how are the two goods related? They are complementary. Now, it actually doesn't matter like how we view M&M peanut candies ourselves or cherry-flavored soft drinks. That doesn't matter at all. This could just be like price of good 1 and the demand for good 2, right? So if the price of good 1 rises, the quantity demanded of good 1 falls. That's just the law of demand. And then if we're told as a result, the demand for good 2 decreases, we get a leftward shift of demand for good 2 that's happened as a result of the price increase for good 1. Well, what's happened is we're actually buying less of both. That's complements, right? That's complements. So that's why we say they're complementary. If we were calculating a cross-price elasticity, we'd get a negative cross-price elasticity, be what we'd expect for complementary goods. The price elasticity of demand is blank relative to the price elasticity of supply. Buyers bear blank of the economic burden of the tax. So we know it's not A because it says small and all. If the buyers are bearing all of the tax, we need a vertical demand curve. We need perfectly inelastic demand. So not just small, it's got to be 0, right? It's specifically 0. So not just like relative to supply, it's price elasticity has to be 0. It has to be a vertical demand curve. Okay, so small and then none? No. We'd have to have, to bear none of the tax, you'd have to have a price elasticity of infinity. You'd have to have a horizontal demand. You have to have a vertical supply curve or horizontal demand. Large, a smaller share. Let's see. If price elasticity of demand is large relative to price elasticity of supply, that means demand is more elastic, so buyers bear less of the tax. Oh, yeah, smaller share. That fits. And then what about large and larger share? Okay, so if price elasticity of demand is large, then no, they don't bear a larger share, right? It's a smaller share. Okay, so it's definitely C. If Beyonce concert tickets are sold out within 5 minutes being released, what do we conclude? There's a control on how high ticket prices can go? No, should be no reason why we'd expect that. Price of tickets is above the equilibrium price. No, if the price is above the equilibrium, price, so that tell us the face value or the sticker price of the tickets was above the equilibrium, then at that price we would actually have a surplus. The quantity supplied of Beyonce tickets is more than quantity demanded. No, that's exactly the same as C. That's the surplus. There's a shortage of Beyonce tickets because what's happened actually would be the listed price of the tickets is below the equilibrium price, right? So the reverse of C actually is what would cause B. Okay, so in the figure below, if the government imposes a tax of $1 in this market, the producers will pay how much of the tax and consumers will pay how much. Okay, so we can actually kind of think about this, zoom in a little bit. And so, well, looking at this, we've got kind of equal slopes. And we actually don't need that so much. We just see like the tax is $1. So that whether this is a tax on buyers or tax on sellers, we know that tax of $1 has to fit exactly where the demand curve is $1 above the supply curve. So that's like right here. So we're looking at a quantity. The tax quantity would be 20 because there's $1, 3 minus 2 right here. Okay, so if we had a tax on sellers, we'd leftward shift the supply curve through this point. This is the price paid by buyers. If there's a tax on buyers, we'd leftward shift the demand curve through this point, and then this would be the price received by sellers. But it is price received by sellers either way. So this is PB, price paid by buyers. This is price received by sellers, PS right here. And the equilibrium price was $2.50. So how do we answer this question? We want to think about how far above is the price paid by buyers relative to the original equilibrium, and how far below is the price received by sellers relative to the original equilibrium. Well, it's 50 cents in both cases, right? And so that's the answer, 50 cents for producers and 50 cents for buyers. They're paying an equal amount of the tax. Suppose the government imposes a $6 per month tax on cell phone usage. If demand for cell phone is perfectly inelastic and supply is elastic but not perfectly elastic, then the price of the cell phone usage, what will happen? So we have perfectly inelastic. So demand is vertical. Supply curve is going to be sloped, right? But not exactly flat, but ish, but not horizontal. So what's going to happen to the price of cell phone? Well, we've got a situation where you'll have the price paid by buyers rising exactly $6 because, as we said before, if demand is perfectly inelastic, buyers are bearing all of the burden of the tax, which means PB is going to rise exactly by the amount of the tax above P star, above the equilibrium price, right? So that's 15. All right, so a meat processing plant produces both steak and ground beef. What effect would rising market prices for steak have on the market for ground beef? Let's see. So if we can produce both steak and ground beef, these are going to be substitutes in production. And so let's think about this. Well, they can't be complements in production, right? We're making steak, ground beef. Well, you could make steak or you could turn the same meat into ground beef. It's kind of how it works. For complements, we're thinking about something where it's more of like you can't help but get the other when you produce the first. You can produce steak without getting ground beef, or you can produce ground beef without getting steak. You cannot produce donut holes without making donuts, or donuts without donut holes, right? So those would be a better example of like complements. What effect would rising market prices have for steak have on the market for ground beef? Well, if the price for steak rises, what will happen is the quantity supplied of steak rises and will produce way less ground beef, right? So the supply of ground beef will decrease, right? All right, so food factory in India makes ice cream and produces processed condensed milk. In the factory, the firm's employees use raw milk and sugar. The firm runs on electricity and purchases raw milk every day. Large robotic assembly lines fill and package ice cream containers. Large industrial freezers store the ice cream. Based on this scenario, can I identify fixed costs for the food factory? Okay, so we said fixed costs were like your infrastructure. It's like the factory. Variable costs are like your ingredients, right? So if you don't produce any ice cream, you still have to pay for the infrastructure for like the factory. But if you're not producing any ice cream, you're not paying for any ingredients, right? And so what we're looking for amongst our fixed costs are the things that you're going to have to pay for whether you make any ice cream or not. So it's definitely not the raw milk produced from farmers, because if we're not making ice cream, we're not buying milk. Cost of employees hired and number of packages purchased? No, because if we're not making any ice cream, we don't need employees or packages to put the ice cream in. The cost of purchasing electricity, raw milk, and sugar? No, that's exactly the ingredients, right? So it's the cost of building the factory, purchasing robotic assembly lines, and industrial freezers. Those are the things you're going to incur. Costs that you will incur whether you make any ice cream or none. All right, Daisy is a milk farmer in a perfectly competitive market where there's many milk farmers. Right, so that tells us Daisy has to be a price taker. The market price of milk is 15 cents per gallon. Marginal cost is also the marginal cost of a gallon per milk. If Daisy charges 25 cents per gallon, Daisy's not going to sell anything. It's going to be undercut. Daisy is ignoring the fact that Daisy's supposed to be a price taker. And so all the customers are just going to buy from everybody else who's selling milk at 15 cents, right? So Daisy doesn't sell anything. If rice is an inferior good, when incomes rise, the equilibrium price will, and the equilibrium quantity will. Okay, so with an inferior good, as your income rises, then demand's going to fall because you're going to substitute for the normal good instead. And we'd expect a negative income elasticity. Relative to this question, if rice is an inferior good, when income rises, the equilibrium price will, and the equilibrium quantity will. Oh, so what's happening? Income's going to rise, so we'll get a decrease in demand for rice, which tells us with a decrease in demand, we think of it, you could draw the picture, a leftward shift of demand, or we could think of consumers just losing interest, right? So decrease, decrease. Total revenue rises if blank and demand is. Okay, so total revenue will rise if price falls and demand is elastic, or if price rises and demand is inelastic. Okay, so rises and perfectly elastic, nope. Falls and inelastic, nope. Falls, elastic, yup. Rises, elastic, no. It's only C. The idea, remember, total revenue is just price times quantity, And when price changes, of course, by the law of demand, there's an impact on quantity. And the reason why when price falls and demand is elastic, revenue rises is because, the price fell, so you're earning less on each unit. However, because demand is elastic, it's super responsive. People buy so much more that the volume effect raises total revenue. The reason why it's not amongst these answers, but a price increase with inelastic demand would lead to higher revenue is because if you raise the price, you're earning more on each unit you're sold. And because demand is inelastic, it's pretty unresponsive to the price increase. By the law of demand, the quantity demanded falls, but not enough to make a difference, and actually revenue rises overall. Okay, so suppose the NFL wants to enable all football fans to attend the Super Bowl. The league therefore sets a price of Super Bowl ticket below what is generally considered a fair price. Suppose the price of a ticket for a regular seat at the big game is set at just $500. People who have tickets, however, can turn around and sell them online for $2,500 or more. If there's no transaction costs associated with online sales of big game tickets, then the true cost to a fan attending the big game it's got to be at least $2,500. Right? Because the idea is if they set the price at $500, but people can turn around and sell them for $2,500, that tells us that the actual equilibrium price is below the listed price, just like the example I was talking about before. So the price has to be at least $2,500. Maybe it's higher. It kind of depends on the seat, I suppose. Not at most $500, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to turn around and find a buyer at $2,500, right? At most $500, not at most $500 because you wouldn't be able to find a buyer at $2,500. Monetary price, the true cost to a fan is the monetary price paid to obtain the ticket. No. The true cost is gonna at least include, if there's no transaction cost, it's gonna at least still include the foregone use of your time doing something else, and then $2,000 less than the opportunity cost. No. Okay, so an increase in demand and an increase in supply will lead to. And we want to know what's going to happen to the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price. You could draw this. You could use the big small method. So you could draw rightward shifts of demand and supply, and in one graph a further rightward shift of demand than supply, and in the other graph a further rightward shift of supply than demand. Or you could borrow my logic, which is when you have an increase in demand, we have consumers competing with each other and bidding up the price. So quantity should rise as well. If you have an increase in supply, we're thinking of flooding the market, and so price is going to fall and quantity rises as well. In both those cases, I said quantity rises, and then I disagreed. Well, the increase in demand leads to a price increase. The increase in supply disagrees and leads to a decrease in price. And so for the increase, or we'll get an increase in equilibrium quantity, and we'll get an indeterminate or ambiguous effect on price. Okay, the demand curve is a curve that shows the maximum willingness to pay for a product. Because willingness to pay is going to be tracking our marginal benefit. We said the theory of demand is the theory of marginal benefit. Indeed, the vertical height of the demand curve at any point gives us the marginal benefit or the willingness to pay for that product. Is a curve that shows the marginal benefit gained from a product? We just said that. Is a curve that shows the production cost of a product? No. So demand curve is not going to say anything about costs. Is a curve that shows the relationship between price of a product and consumers' willingness to pay at each price? That's exactly demand. Okay, so it's going to be B. 1, 2, and 4 are correct. 3 is incorrect. Right? The curve that shows the production cost of a product. Price elasticity of demand is calculated by dividing the percentage change in quantity demanded by the percentage change in price. That's literally the definition of price elasticity of demand. Right? Graphically, shortages always occur at prices below the equilibrium price. And if you're at a point below the equilibrium price and you just draw the graph and find the quantity demanded, it's going to be much further to the right than the quantity supplied. On every graph that you draw, where the prices that we're considering is below the equilibrium price. For normal goods, an increase in income will result in an increase in demand. So if we get an increase in demand, we have consumers competing with each other, bidding up the price. Quantity rises, price rises. So an increase in equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. In the figure below, the original equilibrium is $10,000. A subsidy is introduced for parents who are paying for childcare. After the subsidy is implemented, the amount parents pay is. Okay, so this is demonstrating this is a subsidy received by buyers, right? Subsidy received by buyers. Originally, the price, the equilibrium, was $10,000, and there was 5,000 children in childcare. Now we've got this subsidy that was given to buyers, right? But the price received by sellers is going to be the $11,000, right? The price actually so there's going to be some money out of their pocket. There's going to be some, there's going to be, there's going to be some of the subsidy or whatever, and then the price actually paid for by buyers, like how much came out of their pocket and then how much was contributed by the government, leads to the amount the sellers receive. This is PS, 11,000, and this is price paid by buyers. Remember, it's the reverse for subsidy and tax. For a tax, the top one is the price paid by buyers, and the bottom one is the price received by sellers. For subsidy, it's flipped. And so the top one is the price received by sellers, and the bottom is how much buyers actually pay. So buyers valued 6,000 children in childcare at $9,000, and then government kicked in $2,000 to be able to make that happen, right? Because it cost sellers $11,000 to put 6,000 children in childcare. And so the amount, what was I saying? It's 9,000, but what do we phrase this as? The amount parents pay, yeah. So the price paid by buyers. All right, so we have Gary Parker. Gary Parker is willing to pay $700 for a new iPad. Apple, the producer of iPads, is selling a new iPad for $600. It costs Apple $400 to produce this iPad. How much economic surplus does Gary receive purchasing the iPad? So the economic surplus to Gary is the difference between willingness to pay and the actual price. So that's the $700 minus the $600, that's $100. What's the surplus to Apple, or the profit? So it's going to be the $600 minus $400, or $200. All right, so refer to the graph to answer this question. The movement from point M to point N is a decrease in quantity, the movement from point, sorry, I've read this wrong. M to point N is an increase in quantity demanded, decrease in price, right? So increase in quantity demanded, we're moving down the demand curve, we're moving further to the right, so the quantity is increasing, going from M to N. Okay, Sarah Sandoval is a coffee farmer trying to decide how many tons of coffee to produce, can sell each ton for $3,000. The cost of producing the first is $600. The second is $1,200. Each additional is $600 more to produce. How many tons of coffee should Sarah produce, and what's the total cost? Okay, well, the rational rule for sellers is going to tell us Sarah's going to produce up to the point where the marginal benefit equals to the marginal cost. The marginal benefit is $3,000, so we're going to produce until the marginal cost equals $3,000. Okay, so that's going to take us 5 tons, right? Because each one is going to be 600. 600 times 5 is 6,000. And then if we add that up, 600 plus 1,200 plus 1,800 plus 2,400 plus 3,000, that gives us a total cost of 9,000. Market price for bus travel has increased. Development some economists attribute to the closure of several bus companies. In other words, economists believe, closure of bus companies is going to be a decrease in supply, reduction in the number of sellers in the market. That's a leftward shift of supply that will lead to a higher price and lower quantity. Suppose the price elasticity of demand for Baconators is 0.6. This means the demand is, this is inelastic because this is between 0 and 1, right, in absolute value. So remember, we're thinking about price elasticity, which is percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. It's a ratio. And to get a fraction that's going to be smaller than 1, we have a larger denominator than our numerator, which means we have a larger change in price and smaller change in quantity demanded. That's exactly inelastic demand. All right, so in the market for plastic bags shown here, the original equilibrium is 50 cents per bag. In an effort to reduce plastic usage, a tax is placed on buyers of plastic bags. The amount of the tax is how much? All right, so remember from before we said we could find the tax because it's going to be where it's going to be where the difference between the demand curve, vertical height of the demand curve, and supply curve is exactly the size of the tax. So we have this as a tax on buyers. We leftward shifted the demand curve. This right here is going to correspond to the price paid by buyers. This is going to be the price received by sellers. The quantity is going to be 40 after the tax is implemented. So the size of the tax is going to be 20 cents. Right? So that's this right here. If we were to have a tax on sellers, we'd leftward shift the supply curve actually through this point. That'd give us the price paid by buyers. We'd go down, we'd deduct the tax to find the amount actually received by sellers. And the logic's similar. Okay, so Joshua Murphy is going to stay up late studying for the Econ exam. Contemplating how many coffees to buy tonight. Should not buy an additional coffee during the evening if the marginal benefit is less than the marginal cost. That's just rational rule for buyers. You always want to think carefully about if it makes sense to stay up late before an exam. Obviously, if you haven't studied at all, then maybe the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost of more time studying, right? If it's a math exam, if it's really quantitative, you will probably want to arrange your studying so that you're not staying up super late because at least for me, I found that math and upper level econ classes require a lot more. It's like a lot of art. It's a lot of creativity and thinking cleverly to apply the things that you know. And so you don't want to be too tired because you might not be able to have full functioning of your capacities that you might need to solve tricky problems. Anyway, so if the price of Tide falls and the demand for Purex decreases, what do we conclude? This is same thing as before. Price of good one falls. What we're going to expect is an increase in quantity demanded for good one. The demand for good two decreases. Oh, an increase in quantity demanded for good one and then decrease in demand for good two. It's because they're buying more of good one. So they're substitutes. Right? Okay, so yogurt has a perfectly inelastic demand and an upward sloping supply curve. So vertical demand curve, standard upward sloping supply curve. Cheese has a perfectly inelastic supply curve and downward sloping demand curve. Cheese has a vertical supply curve. If the same tax is imposed on sellers of both yogurt and cheese, then, cheese has a perfectly inelastic supply, so sellers will bear the entire burden of the tax for cheese. And then in the case of yogurt, it's a perfectly inelastic demand curve. So despite the fact that the tax is imposed on sellers, actually buyers will bear the entire burden of the tax for yogurt. And so the price paid by, the price paid by consumers of yogurt raises by more than the price paid by consumers of cheese. Yeah, because what's going to happen is the price paid by consumers of yogurt is going to rise by exactly the amount of the tax because demand is perfectly inelastic. And what will happen is price paid by consumers of cheese is actually going to stay the same. It'll just be the equilibrium price, and the price received by sellers drops down by the amount of the tax because sellers are going to be the ones that are bearing the entire burden. Price ceiling, by definition, just the maximal price the seller can charge in the market. If the price elasticity supply for a good is 2, the price elasticity of demand, and then I say it wrong. Price elasticity of supply for a good is 2 if a blank in price leads to a 4% decrease in quantity supplied. Right, so quantity supplied is going to be the numerator. Percentage change in price is going to be the denominator. So we have minus 4 divided by something equals 2. So minus 4 divided by minus 2 equals 2. Yeah, 2% decrease. Price of milk in the grocery store rises by 25%. Quantity demanded of milk falls by 10%. What's the absolute value price elasticity demand? So it's going to be 10 divided by 25 is going to be 0.4. And that's inelastic. Aren't you glad there wasn't midpoint formula? Right? All right, so new economic report discusses high probability that sugar prices will rise soon. The expectation of sugar prices rising leads to, so we believe sugar prices will rise in the future. So we don't want to have to pay them. So we want to be able to buy now. So it's going to be an increase in demand. So we're talking about supply. So we have a decrease in demand today. I gave you a whole bunch of them. Okay, so decrease in demand. I said it. We have an increase in demand. So we can rule out A immediately. Now we see the rest are just talking about supply. This is silly. Government subsidy, whatever. So increased in supply today and a fall in sugar prices, or decreased supply today and a rise in sugar prices. If we're talking about suppliers, we believe prices are going to rise soon. So why sell today? We'll sell in the future. So we'll get a decrease in supply now, and then we'll have, as a result of the decrease in supply, right, increasing scarcity, sugar prices rise. Then in the future, sugar prices actually rise, and at that point, we'd increase our quantity supplied, right? So remember, in the immediate period, you'll get the change in demand or supply, and then in the future, you get the price actually. So in the immediate term, what's changed was the belief, so that is one of our demand shifters or supply shifters. And then after that's happened, then in the future, the price change actually happens, after which we only get the change in quantity. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this here, and then I will see you in the next video. So, bye for now.